Okay. All right. As I mentioned a few moments ago, this presentation is going to focus on small-scale composting, backyard composting, and some of the principles involved, a little bit of the scientific background, and then some suggestions I have based on what I've read and what I've experienced in my own composting efforts. Now, with our traditional method of disposing of our waste, including the organic waste, has been to bury them in the ground, landfills. And to me, that's really probably the worst way of disposing of our organic waste. We lock up our nutrients and our energy sources within these anaerobic pits, because that's what they are. Nothing's really decomposing at any fast rate within those landfills. Fortunately, many communities have passed ordinances, laws, etc., that say you cannot put leaves, yard waste, etc., in landfills. You've got to handle them in some other way. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, some communities, some industries have gone in a direction of incinerating waste, burning waste, including some of our organic waste. And again, this is a real poor way of handling our organic waste, because we're burning off the carbon, burning off that energy source, which would provide some benefit to soil organisms if we applied them on land. So I have, again, some real difficulty with incinerating all types of organic waste, including paper, yard waste, leaves, etc. And many communities have gone away from this primarily for economic reasons. Okay, next slide, please. To me and to many people in agriculture and the organic agricultural movement feel that the best way of handling organic waste is to recycle them on land. Recycle the nutrients, recycle the energy on that land, on that soil. But it has to be done carefully and properly. Right now there are efforts underway to expand application of sludge waste, compost, etc. on land. And there's a lot of debate about whether that's good or bad. And it has to be done carefully. But to me, the soil is the proper medium for applying our waste. And it may go two directions. We can apply organic waste directly, or composted waste, which is the stable humus product of decomposition. A lot of scientific evidence that applying compost, regardless of what the raw material is, on soils provides benefit to that soil. Physical properties are improved. Compaction can be overcome. Structures improved, drainage and aeration are improved, so you're really benefiting that soil in a physical way. Also, the chemical properties and the biological properties are benefited. We improve provide substrate to our biota and improve the nutrient holding capacity of those soils. Okay, so there's some real advantages to applying those compost and even those wastes to those soils. Next slide, please. Now, it's interesting that a number of communities have gone. There are really several directions we can go with composting. And composting can be done on a big commercial scale, where we get these big in-vessel systems or outdoor windrow systems where waste might be mixed and then composted, and then community members can have access to that end product. The problem I see with that is potential contamination of that compost with metals, toxic organic compounds, etc., depending on what was mixed to begin with. But all of you, I'm sure, are aware of all the surreptitious waste mixing that goes on even in the home. You know, we mix in materials that may contaminate that. And then on a much larger scale, on a commercial level, it can be a real problem. The other direction is to separate the waste at their origin, at the home, at the apartment, etc., and composting that organic fraction, and not even integrating that into our waste streams. In my travels, I happened to be up in James Bay a couple of years ago, and traveling back, I went by one of the many lakes in northern Ontario, and one of the communities in North Bay had this little display out encouraging home composting. That's in a very northern climate, very cold climate, and it can be done under really rigorous conditions. Seattle probably has one of the finest community-organized home composting program underway, and they have really integrated education into that program. Next slide, please. Hey, a good question might be, what exactly is composting? To me, composting is speeding up a natural process of decomposition. We are affecting the rate. We're speeding that process up so we get that end product quicker. Now, composting can be done in a variety of ways, and the speed that you get your compost depends on how you manage it. But to me, it's simply a natural process, and what we're doing is trying to create the conditions ideal for those organisms involved in composting. Next slide, please. Now, decomposition, like I said, is a natural process. It happens in the forest floor, it happens in farm fields, it happens in grasslands, all kinds of environments. In your soil, there is a natural decomposition process. And the rate of that process depends on a range of factors, environmental factors, temperature, moisture, aeration, things that I'll talk about when I talk about composting. It also depends on the kind of material being deposited on the soil. It has a very big effect on how fast that material decomposes. Next slide, please. Now, a prominent soil ecologist from State University of New York College of Forestry in Syracuse, Dan Dindal, has done a lot of work with compost piles. He's studied compost piles, he's studied compost toilets, and the number of organisms involved and some of the ecology of those systems. And he's come up with a nice schematic of all the variety of organisms involved in decomposition. And I think a lot of people in the compost field, even people in all kinds of fields, tend to focus on the bacteria, on the microorganisms, but I like to look at the macroorganisms as well, because they do play an important role. And there's a lot of interaction among all those organisms, macroorganisms and microorganisms, and what we try to do in a compost pile or a compost structure is to create conditions, environmental conditions, that provide a nice habitat for these organisms. And it really depends on the type of system you've got as to which organisms will be predominant in a compost system. There's a lot more interest in composting using earthworms, vermicomposting, which is very different than traditional composting. Okay, next slide, please. The most prevalent organism in a compost pile are your bacteria. They do the bulk of the decomposition. And there are a range of bacterial forms. Some of them are aerobic, most of them are aerobic, require oxygen to break down that organic matter. Others are anaerobic. And so you can even get very slow rate of decomposition in an anaerobic environment. Some bacteria are also involved in important nutrient transformations within that compost pile that make something like nitrogen available to plants. Now, these organisms can feed on a number of the materials that you put in a compost pile, but they cannot generally break down the woody materials to a great extent. Next slide, please. The fungi, and this is kind of a poor slide, but at least it allows me to talk about these organisms. The fungi and actinomycetes, the molds, the mushrooms, yeasts, it's primarily the molds and the mushrooms, are important decomposers in a natural environment as well as a compost pile. And these organisms are very high oxygen demanding, and they tend to predominate on the exterior of a compost pile, but they are extremely important. They help to break down those resistant compounds, and primarily in woody products. If you're adding any kind of woody product to a compost pile, these have the enzymes to break that material down. And from what I've read through my, again, interest in this field, these are the most important organisms as far as humus formation is concerned in native soils. And my guess is it's the same is true in a compost pile. You've got to have the fungi to process some of that more difficult to decompose material. The fungi also predominate in acid soils. So if you acidify, if you use a lot of acidic materials in a compost pile, it may decompose slowly, but it will still decompose. And humus will definitely be formed in those environments. Okay, next slide, please. And we start working to the macroorganisms. Those are the major microorganisms. We also have nematodes. And nematodes, unfortunately, have gotten a real bum rap in the field of agriculture. They are implicated in a number of diseases, plant diseases, but only about 1 to 5% of all nematodes in your soil have a negative effect on plant growth. The rest of them are very important in the soil, particularly as decomposers. They help to decompose organic matter. They feed on bacteria. So there's a lot of interplay in that compost pile. Next slide, please. Earthworms, very important decomposers. And again, in native soils, any kind of soil, they are one of the principal decomposers of organic matter. They feed on raw organic matter. They help to process that. And that's true of a lot of these macroorganisms. They kind of make the food bite-sized for the microbes. They increase the surface area and help to spread those microorganisms throughout that mass as they defecate throughout that pile. Okay, so there's a lot of processing going on by particularly earthworms. Now there's the lumbricus earthworm, which is really the dominant earthworm in soils. And that one is an important decomposer, but there's also the manure worm, which is Eisenia, which is a red wiggler worm, which is sold commercially for composting operations. And those are the ones that'll feed on garbage and a variety of organic substrates. Those two don't tend to get along too well. I tend to like, and it's in the people in the field say that you should isolate the Eisenia, the red wigglers, let them feed on their substrate, and they'll do a fine job. Okay, next slide, please. And there are others, mites. They're important decomposer mites. And they also feed on fungi. They again, help to control populations as they function in that compost pile and in soils. Next slide, please. Beetles, a variety of insects, are important decomposers. They feed on raw organic material and bite it up, chew it up. Next slide, please. Isopods, which are, you see if you lift a log, you'll see these little organisms running around underneath, and they help to degrade some of the woody products. They have the enzymes that can break it down, or they might have a microorganism living within their gut that helps to break down that woody product. Next slide, please. And maggots are important decomposers. We tend to view them with some disdain, but they are important decomposers in your soil. Okay, so now that I've given you a feel for the broad diversity of organisms involved, again, what we're trying to do in a compost pile is create the habitat which benefits those organisms. And again, it may depend on what kind of composting you'd like to do and how fast you want to achieve that end product. Well, there's a number of materials that can be used in composting. And what I did was I made a list of composting substrates that can be used on a large scale as well as a small scale. The ones that we would utilize in a backyard operation would be obviously your yard waste. They are important. There's a range of yard waste which can be used. And what I'll do in a couple of moments is go through those and give you some of the, it's a little bit of information on how well they decompose. You would not be utilizing sewage sludge in a backyard compost pile unless you're utilizing compost toilets, which would utilize human wastes. Animal manures are important, can be an important source, particularly in rural environments. And even in urban environments, Saratoga, which has the horse tracks, has a plentiful supply of horse manure that they're willing to give away. In fact, they're composting their own right now. Food waste, municipal waste, paper wastes, etc. Those are all, again, organic products that we produce or we utilize in our lifestyles that can be composted, backyard as well as larger scale. Next slide, please. All right, one thing that you'll find with wastes that are produced in a home environment is their seasonality. You know, you get some materials like leaves mostly in the fall. We get garden waste throughout the year. We get kitchen waste throughout the year. And the idea is to try to get a balance of those materials as you prepare a compost pile. And sometimes that can be real tricky. In my garden, which I have, I just took a few slides here showing you some of the yard wastes I had, the garden waste that I had about a month ago. Peas that I was pulling up because they were finished producing, some old bolted lettuce. This is nice green material, and I call this a nitrogen source. And I'm really kind of focused on two big categories of organic waste: nitrogen sources and carbon sources, even though both contain both elements. This is a high nitrogen source, particularly the peas. The way I view it is I've got nitrogen that I took out of the atmosphere via nitrogen fixation. It's been locked up in that plant, and I pull them up and then utilize those in my compost operation. So they are an important source of nitrogen. Okay, next slide, please. We can have tree prunings, hedge prunings that can be usable. They might be slightly woody if they're large stems. They might be acidic. This is a hemlock hedge that I pruned. And this material, like any conifer material, has tannic acid, which really inhibits most of your decomposers, and it can slow your compost pile down significantly. Next slide, please. Now with prunings, shredding them, breaking them down physically is important to speed the process up. And I'll make a few more comments about this later on. Next slide, please. Leaves. Leaves are seasonal. We get most of our leaves in the fall here in the Northeast. And there are a number of types of leaves, and they vary in their decomposability. Next slide, please. Maple leaves, elm leaves, hickory, etc. Those tend to be less acidic in nature. They tend to store the base. The bases get left behind. The calcium, magnesium gets left behind in the leaves as those leaves fall to the ground. So they are not as acidic as some other types of leaves. And they are very good as far as an amendment to a compost pile. Excellent source of primarily carbon. They may have some nitrogen on them. Now it's interesting too, because some of these leaves, as they fall from trees, they already contain some of the decomposing bacteria on them. Some research has shown that they're present, bacteria are present on those leaves, and they become active as those leaves fall to the ground. And insects help spread those bacteria. And that may be true as well in a home environment. Okay, next slide, please. I would avoid oak leaves and any of your conifer needles, primarily because of the tannic acid content that really inhibits decomposers, and it slows the process down. If you're not concerned about how long it takes, that's fine, but it really does take long to break these leaves down. It's years to break down oak leaves, even if you shred them up. Okay, pine needles as well tend to build up, and I'm sure you notice that as you walk through a forest, hiking trail, whatever, you notice the conifer litter tends to build up. Next slide, please. Okay, we produce a lot of kitchen wastes. Corn, cobs, husks, especially if you do a lot of canning and freezing, you're producing a lot of food waste. And these are very good for a compost pile. Good source of nitrogen if they're green. They do contain more protein, more nitrogen. Some of them may be more of a carbon source, like your corn husks. Next slide, please. Orange peels. There's been some, I read in an article where there's some concern about the orange peels because of the pesticides that are used on oranges, that they may be accumulated within the peel itself. They've done some work to see how readily those pesticides may volatilize off or break down within a compost pile. And of course, if we're getting high temperatures in the compost pile, we may speed up the breakdown of those pesticides. I still use orange peels in my compost pile, figuring that, again, it's maybe a very, very tiny amount in there, but the dilution factor is very significant. And I really would bet that it probably isn't that significant a problem. Next slide, please. Wood products are an important source of carbon, probably the best source of carbon you got. The problem is you can have very little to no nitrogen in the wood material. An important thing here too is obviously to break the material down, and this is just some wood that's been cut up, and the sawdust left behind is an excellent compost material. Next slide, please. Just another view of, I stockpile this stuff right near my compost pile and just leave it out and use it.
Sawdust?
Yes?
What about the residue of chainsaw oil and stuff?
I hadn't given any thought to that, and that's a good point. What about the oils that are there? Again, if it's a significant amount, I'd say that could be a problem, both from the inhibiting the organisms that are decomposing the material and from a human health perspective. Probably, again, the dilution factor may help alleviate that problem. You're probably adding such a minute amount that it will not be a serious concern. I sat in on the talk on organic matter, and so I don't know how many of you sat in on that with Paul Sachs. And he talked about it's not the poison, but the dose that's the concern. And maybe that kind of thing could be used here, that kind of philosophy. But that's a very interesting point. I think we find that as we look at many of these raw materials for composting, they may indeed be contaminated even though they're organic materials. And you should make an effort to try to minimize that. Okay, next slide, please. Paper waste. Paper is acceptable for compost, but I throw my paper towels, especially if they're contaminated with a little bit of food waste. It's inoculating with a little bit of bacteria that way. The concern as far as the ink is less now because of more soy inks, soy-based inks being used, which are biodegradable, and non-metallic based inks on newspaper print. Yes?
Excuse me, are you concerned at all with the bleaching process or the dyeing or the purging process of things like paper towels and tissue?
The dioxin residues, yeah. And that again is an area that is still pretty vague. We don't know what levels. I'm sure in some of those products there are residues there. And I tend to view it as I'm not really loading so much of that material on there that I would be building up a level.
So are you going to be using your end product on a vegetable garden?
Sure.
Putting paper waste?
What I do is I maybe throw in 2 paper towels into a pile that's maybe 2-3 feet high. So again, I don't think, my intuition is, I don't believe I have a level in there that may be a problem.
So you're not doing all your paper waste, you're doing it very selective.
Very selective, right. For example, all my newspapers, magazines are recycled. Those go to the recycling stream. And with me, it's just, a handful of paper towels, and that's it. And that's a good concern. Again, I would say that, don't overload. Now, what'll happen is in fact, if you put too much of that, it would pretty much stop your composting process because of the excessive carbon. Okay, so there's kind of a natural feedback mechanism there to help protect you. But that, again, is a very important concern. Hopefully in the future they'll drift away from that bleaching process and move to more environmentally friendly methods of bleaching paper, or even use non-bleach paper. Yes?
I had a question a moment ago when you said not put oak leaves or the needles in there, but before you'd shown that you were putting the hemlock branches in.
Right. That's a good question. The question is, why did I say don't put any hemlock leaves, but I showed a slide of chopping up those hemlock. I was using those. That slide was there to demonstrate the concept of breaking down, shredding up material. And in fact, I didn't use that in my compost pile. I used it as a mulch for my blueberries. So that was kind of an unfair slide to throw in there. It was just to demonstrate the shredding of material. And again, you could add a little handful in, but if you put too much in, you'd stop your composting process. Yes?
Yeah, just a comment on oak leaves again. I've seen shredded oak leaves break down in like 3 months, left in a pile, in their own little pile, big pile.
Okay.
And then like 3 months, really break down quite far.
Okay.
After being shredded.
Okay. Comment made about oak leaves breaking down in a shredded state within about 3 months. Were they old leaves? Were they relatively?
They were brown. I mean, they were like last fall's leaves shredded.
Okay.
After they had already turned brown, and within like 3 months, digging into the pile, and it was incredible.
Was nice. Okay, that proves that that it will break down, and my experience has been primarily mulching with those leaves, and if you mulch with them, it takes much longer to break down than in a compost pile.
Sure.
Those are leaves by themselves?
Were those
Yeah,
those were leaves by
yeah.
themselves?
By themselves.
That's what I've heard, that you should keep the leaves separate out of the pile because they break down more by fungal action.
Right.
Rather than the heat of the compost pile just speeding it up.
That's a good point.
And they also mat. It's put in too heavy a pile in compost and kind of makes a barrier.
Right, they can mat. My one suggestion is you can probably add small amounts and they won't mat as much. Mix them up well, and if you're vermicomposting, the earthworms will help maintain the aeration in there, prevent the matting, and may help spread some of the fungi as well. You're right, the fungi are primarily involved in breaking those leaves down. If you have the right mix of materials in the compost pile, you may have enough fungi in there to help break them down, but it'll be much slower. That's a good point. By isolating them, keeping them separate, that's probably a good way of handling those. Good point. Okay, next slide, please. I didn't ask you to, if you got any comments, questions, just jump right in. I'm more comfortable with that format anyway. All right, this is one group of animals that is an important source of compost raw materials. In agricultural communities, manures are an important compost raw material. Next slide, please. And manures are important, and depending on the type of material, type of animal, age of the material, the amount of bedding that you've got, manure can serve as an important source of both carbon and nitrogen. The wet manures, cow manures, sheep manures are an important source of nitrogen, but horse manures tend to be mixed in with quite a bit of bedding material, and that can actually be more of an important carbon source rather than nitrogen source. Important source of decomposing organisms as well. Okay, next slide, please. And then you have your straw, hay, etc., which can be used to a limited degree. These are primarily carbon sources for a compost pile. It also can be an important source of insulating material for winter composting. You can build a compost pile surrounded by hay bales for the winter time, and that'll help insulate that pile and maintain warm temperatures. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I'm not putting this slide up to endorse a product or to criticize a product. It's just that it's the one I happen to have in my apartment when I was preparing the slides for the talk. There's some debate about whether you should add the product that's generally referred to as an inoculant. Whether you should add these activators, inoculants, whatever, to your compost pile. And I've looked at the contents of these products, and it ranges from a variety of organisms. Claims are made that there's decomposing organisms within this material. There's enzymes. There's some kind of biostimulants in there. A range of products. Now, I find that if you have a compost pile to which you've added soil, or which you've added manure, or contaminated waste, even food waste, there's plenty of decomposers there to do the job. And you don't need to add these activators. However, I found that, and I've got a tumbler composter, and in that one I've thrown in a lot of woody wastes and yard waste, kitchen waste, and I have added some of this material, and it did heat it up quicker. I did notice a change. So I attribute primarily to the enzymes that were there. They helped to initiate that breakdown. But again, for outdoor composting, backyard composting, I am not convinced that you need to go to the expense of purchasing these products to help your compost pile. You should be able to do it without them. But again, I don't know enough about what's in these and what the purpose is to really make a concrete statement. Hey, next slide, please. This slide's blank because it's the slide in which I want to talk about what not to add to compost. And I forgot to take a picture of some non-biodegradables, so I've included a blank slide here. Things that you don't want to add are anything that won't break down. You don't want to add any plastic products. And I chuckle when I kind of, not only chuckle, but I get a little irritated when I hear about biodegradable plastics. These materials that supposedly break down. Well, they're partially biodegradable. The little molecules that connect the plastic parts biodegrade, but it leaves a lot of plastic particles. So don't add any of that. I don't encourage people to add any meat products, bones, meat, etc., primarily because it can attract organisms that you don't want in that pile. And now with the rabies scares that we've got, I think that would be a good idea not to add any of that kind of material. But I've got a friend who's thrown all kinds of meat scraps into his compost pile where he utilizes earthworms to break it down, the red wigglers, and he's successfully done it that way. But it's got to be you've got to be really careful about it. Other things, I would definitely not add anything that has been significantly contaminated with pesticides, and that would be primarily lawn clippings that were sprayed with herbicides. There's no data out there that shows that those herbicides break down in a compost pile. They're not certain. Leaves, question may occur as to leaves that were collected, leaves you may get off the street that have been contaminated with maybe pesticides that were sprayed. The tree spraying programs, which have really diminished in the last few years, but research has shown that many of those pesticides are applied very early in the year, early in the summer, and they tend to be washed out significantly by the time you're using them in your compost pile. So the concern would be much less about that than the grass clippings. Anybody think of anything else you wouldn't want to add?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Dairy?
Dairy products, yeah, that again is similar to the meat products. The digestibility of those products is slower, and it can again create a problem. I add some eggshells. I add, if I have some spoiled material, I'll throw just very small amounts though. Got to be really careful. Pardon me?
Cat droppings, like...
Right, domestic animal droppings, anything that can serve as a source of human pathogens, and particularly cat droppings and even dog droppings, I would not add.
Although the green litter is really good because all it is pressed alfalfa, and that'll speed the decomposition up. So if you don't have any green matter, you can go out and buy a 50-pound bag for $1 or $2 and use that.
Okay.
It'll cook it real quick.
Okay, and that's an important point. The idea of the whole issue of an inoculum, meaning nitrogen. A lot of people refer to nitrogen as the inoculum for a compost pile, and that could help definitely. But the domestic animal waste definitely I would avoid. Yes.
Yeah, black walnut is not a good thing to use either.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Exactly. Black walnut inhibits it. There's a compound in there that inhibits plants, particularly tomato plants.
Yeah.
And the residues, leaves, stems, etc., if you put that in a pile, if you throw that on your garden, it may act to inhibit your plant growth, like certain allelopathic type effects. Yes?
So did you say that with dairy it's more that it might attract animals and it's hard to decompose?
Right.
And that there's no...
And maybe the moisture content might be excessive. So that would really be the only concern I would have. I've experimented a little bit with it. I've thrown some sour cream that's got mold all over it. It's been in the refrigerator for maybe 5 or 6 months, and it's just not good to use. And I've thrown it on there figuring, well, I've got some microorganisms already in there that may help inoculate my compost pile, and that's degraded slowly. I mean, slower than some of your other raw materials. And I take eggshells; those break down slowly. And they can again attract your unwanted organisms, but I've done it on very small amounts, and I think with that it can work all right. I've even thrown some moldy cheese in there. Moldy bread's fine. Again, you're adding some of the molds, decomposers, to your pile. Yes.
I have an anal retentive composting friend in Oregon who keeps all of his meat, fat, and suet and that sort of thing in the freezer until wintertime, and he hangs it in bags over his compost bins, and the birds come in and he gets rid of his fats in that manner.
That's interesting. Good.
It creates more nitrogen for
Sure.
the pile when they...
That's excellent. A good way of transferring those nutrients in energy. That's great. Excellent. I've never thought about that. I've usually thrown it in the freezer and thrown it out with my non-recyclable, non-organic waste, but probably a better way of doing it. Okay, those are great. Anything else at this point? Anybody else have any ideas on what else they could add or not add? As you can see, there's a lot of material here that we can use in our composting. So, okay, next slide, please. Now, I just want to make a few comments here as far as what's going on in a compost pile, what's really happening, and how we can really maximize this process by benefiting those decomposing organisms. Now, when we put a pile of organic material together in a proper ratio, proper proportions, what happens is it stimulates the organisms. We're providing them with food, and they begin to feed on it, they begin to reproduce. And so what happens is our temperature begins to increase. And the reason the temperature increases is because we've created a pile that's somewhat self-insulating. If you've created a large enough pile, the respiratory heat, the metabolic heat that's produced gets trapped, and the temperature rises. At the same time, since those organisms are reproducing, feeding, etc., the oxygen levels decrease. And that's where we can have some problems here, really with both. Very high temperatures, low oxygen. And we manage that compost pile, compost structure, whatever, to maintain that oxygen temperature at optimum levels. The other thing that will happen is some moisture will be lost. And there's some debate. Again, I read articles where they say, well, moisture will be gained, moisture will be lost. But intuitively, if you generate a lot of heat and some of that heat comes off, it's going to carry the moisture with it and evaporate it off. And there tends to be a slight decline in moisture content. By the end, what will happen is the bacteria start up real quickly, but they run out of energy. eventually they run out of substrates that they can readily break down. They just don't have the enzymes to break down some of the other stuff. Cellulose, lignin, etc. remains. And the fungi take over. They're a little slower acting. Temperatures begin to decline. The macroorganisms take over as the temperatures decline further. Then eventually the material is stabilized. And during that process, a lot of carbon dioxide is given off. And so what happens is the volume decreases. The volume of material will decrease up to 50%. So it'll shrink. And that's good if you're concerned about volumes of material. Now the day length depends on how you manage it, how frequently you turn it, etc. And I'll again make some comments in a few moments. Okay, next slide please.
Why does that oxygen level go up at the end?
That's good. Could you go back? Why does it go up in the end? The reason it'll go up in the end, that's a good point. What I think that reflects is this is a managed compost pile where you're turning it frequently.
So you're always introducing more oxygen.
Right.
Okay.
Now I'll make some comments about turning. When you turn a pile, you're primarily doing that really to release the heat. But in the process, you're adding the oxygen. And that's what happens here. And as you do that, and as the materials are broken down, there's less of a demand for that oxygen. So it tends to go up.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, next slide, please. As I said, and I just showed this slide here to show you that there is a release of heat and there is a release of moisture in the form of steam. And these were windrows, long windrows. They were about 6 feet high. They were turning them. This was at a research operation out at Cornell University, doing a lot of work with farm waste composting. Okay, next slide, please. I've got a slide up here, and this is, I looked through all, you get all kinds of books, magazines, articles on composting, and everybody has their own ideas about what's best. And what I did was I kind of got an average of all those ideas and put it down as far as what are ideal conditions for what I call thermophilic composting, which is higher temperature composting. If you're doing vermicomposting with worms, this is not ideal, particularly the temperature range. Okay, the oxygen should be more than 5%. There's no way that you'll really measure that. I wouldn't go to any kind of expense of buying any kind of equipment for measuring your oxygen levels. You'll ensure that by proper turning. The moisture, 40 to 60%. If you have a proper mix of your raw materials, you have some wet materials, some dry materials in a proper ratio, that should provide you with good moisture content. I tend to use quite a few leaves, sawdust in my pile, and I have to add a little bit of water. And again, they use terms like slightly squeezed out sponge, the consistency of that as far as your compost, and that's the moisture content you should have. And that's very non-scientific, non-technical, but again, you use your own judgment with a lot of this. The C to N ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio, is important. That 30 to 1 is the value I've found. It's what's generally recommended. Some people say about 20 to 30 to 1. I tend to go a little on the high side, primarily because of concerns about nitrates leaching out of that pile.
Is that by weight, by bulk,
This is by percentage. In other words, you can analyze a corn cob, you can analyze a bunch of leaves, and it'll come out and say for leaves it might be 70 or 80% carbon to 1% nitrogen. You take your percentages and divide them. Okay, so that's a percent ratio. There's a lot of tables, a lot of gardening magazines have C to N ratios for different materials. I don't get too caught up in the numbers game though. I found the more I get into this, the further I get away from the real scientific approach to this. The more I get into just doing it, trying it, see how it works, doing some experimenting on my own and see how it works, and really watching the process and thinking it through. And you'll find that probably works better than trying to get exact amounts. Okay, temperature is very important, especially if you're doing larger piles. And usually you don't want to let your piles your structure getting higher than 5 feet, or 5 feet high, 5 feet wide. That's the maximum. You get any bigger than that, you're going to trap too much heat. And if that range there, I've got in centigrade, also got in Fahrenheit. This is the range again for thermophilic composting, which is high temperature composting. If you're using worms again to break down your wastes, you'll be lower than that. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you gave a maximum size pretty much for the home compost, but you want to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet.
Exactly, there's a minimum size, good point. The comment made about the minimum size, you want to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, right. Smaller than that, what'll happen is you won't reach high enough temperatures to get thermophilic composting. It'll be very slow. The only exception is if you're doing worm composting. There you can have a smaller volume, definitely. Yes?
Do you have any trouble, because I sometimes stockpile my leaves, and then add them in, and sometimes you get some worms and so on in those leaves. Now, if you put those in and then with the grass clippings and heats up, do you kill those worms?
You will cook them, yeah. You will cook those worms.
How do you use-
If it's a large volume. If you reach a temperature up around 100, 120 degrees, you will kill most of them.
The worms will generally go down.
They'll migrate. Okay, they can migrate. If it's in a closed structure without any exits to it, they'll die, but they can migrate out. That's a good point.
No, it's just a bin, so they will get out then.
Okay, they'll escape. They will move away from heat, they'll move away from light, so that would solve your problem. Yes?
How do you utilize worms?
Pardon me?
How do you utilize worms in composting?
I'm gonna, if I could, I'm gonna make some real, a general description of that when I get to different systems. So if you could hold your question until then, and if I haven't satisfactorily answered it, make sure you get back to me. Okay, yes?
There's a maximum size as opposed to of the,
Pardon me?
there's a maximum size of the pie to its closed.
Yes, the maximum I would say would be no higher than 5 feet, no higher than 5 feet, no wider than 5 feet. Now it can be longer than 5 feet, and some of the commercial windrows may be 20, 30, 100 feet long, but they still stick to that maximum height and width. Yeah. And that's again to make sure you don't go over this temperature. You get over this temperature, you're going to kill all your decomposers. And that's a real negative. You don't want to sterilize the material. You want to retain your decomposers. My question over here. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about materials to go into the bin. I keep
Okay.
trash bags in my truck, and I live along the shore, and I grab, after a storm, seaweed. And I've heard different issues. They've got great little shells and all sorts of great stuff in them, in the seaweed, but I tend to throw it in a pile before I put it in my compost bin because I fear salt.
Yeah,
Is that something I'd be worried about, or?
I would be slightly concerned about the salt content, mostly from a plant health perspective. Now, what will probably happen is most of them will probably leach out if you leave them on a stockpile. The salts will leach out because they're all soluble, and that should take care of the problem.
Well, my question is, I just assume come in and put it right into my bins. If it's going to be, I don't turn my bins
Okay.
on mine at all. I have like 5 bins, and I just let it do its own thing. And do you think that it's going to eventually go out of the bins, the salt itself, or do I really need to keep it away from, let it leach out?
What's under your bin? Is it
Just dirt.
soil?
Just made
Okay.
out of pallets.
How long are you composting? For what period of time? And through what season are you doing it?
I just load up a bin at a time, and I've got 5 of them, so one may take 8 months to break down on its own or something.
Okay. My guess is the salts would leach out of there. Is the top open and accessible?
Sides are, yeah.
It should leach out.
Could you rinse it first?
You could, yeah, you could wet it down first.
Take a hose,
Yeah.
because it needs to be wet anyhow.
Yeah.
To it then.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
My guess is if you're putting in that pile, leaving it for that period of time, and especially if you add some moisture to begin with, should leach it out. Yep. Yes?
Yeah, just on the comment on the size of the pile again. I've seen commercial operations where the piles are like 20 feet high,
Right.
big bills, and they just turn them like once or twice a year.
Right, that's one of the many options that they use in the commercial operations, and they are getting very high temperatures and then eventually creating anaerobic pockets within it. They'll go in there, turn it, and all the steam will come off. And I would say for a small scale, you don't want to have a real big pile like that because you're killing off your decomposers, and it's slowing the process down. But you're right, commercially they do use that approach. Yeah.
If you're trying to decide, like say you have a long pile of manure about 5 feet high or whatever, and you want to know how often to turn that, would you actually check the temperature of it to see whether it's getting up above?
Exactly. The temperature monitoring for something like that is the most important thing you can do. And what you do is you use this maximum as your guideline. Once you hit 140 degrees, it's time to turn. When you turn, you're primarily releasing the heat, at the same time oxygenating it. They found that it takes 9 times more turning to get rid of the heat than it does to add the necessary oxygen. So if you turn enough to manage the temperature, you're automatically taking care of the oxygen needs. Yes?
Isn't it true, though, that it's also good to turn it when the temperature starts decreasing?
Depends at what stage. Okay, if it's at the tail end of decomposition, you're getting stabilization.
As you're going down the slope, that's a good time to...
Right, you would still want to turn to get some of those important decomposers that break down the more resistant compounds within your mass and expose the exterior to that interior of the pile. Sure. Yeah, you would maintain that mixing to the end. Yeah. Yes?
I'm not so sure that it's important to get to that maximum temperature before you, because if you don't have it, I mean, sometimes you may not have it exactly right. You may only get to like 130.
Oh, sure.
Once it starts coming down, that's when the action's decreasing. That's when you want to turn it.
Sure.
You may never get to one.
Right, especially for the smaller size piles, definitely. What I'm saying is if you get higher than that, you're going to kill your decomposers. Then you definitely have to do it. But you can do it sooner, sure. Yeah.
Well,
Definitely.
in a New England climate, what would be a practical number of times to turn a pile like that?
That's a real debatable point. And for a tumbler composter, I turn that, I might turn it every other day. And I don't even monitor the temperature when I do it because I can just tell by the heat coming off it, just by putting my hand in there, that it's time to turn it. Okay, I do those very frequently because physically it's very easy to do. If you have a bin system, you may turn it once a week. You may turn it every 3 days. The more frequently you turn it, generally the quicker the process goes. For a New England climate, again, it depends on how much time and energy you want to invest.
But for a big pile, a big manure pile, if you get manure delivered in the spring,
Yeah.
and you have a very cold winter climate, would you wait until, say, midway through the summer and then turn it, or wait till fall? And then
If you have a big one, I would turn it one time in the summer, then one time in the fall again. Yeah.
You've only got half an hour left, and questions are important, but I'm concerned you're not going to make it.
Okay, thank you. All right, next slide, please. Skip through these. I just listed these. I've already talked about these. Oxygen's needed, again, for aerobic processes. Next slide, please. Moisture, again, that's something you can manage by adding water, or if you have too much moisture, adding absorbent materials, carbon materials. I've made comments on carbon to nitrogen ratio. This depends on the mix of materials you're using. Temperature, I've made plenty of comments on. That's very important in your composting process. Next slide, please. Now, the two things you're going to do is provide the proper mix of material, and there's all kinds of formulas out there. I tend to use about 2 parts of green material to 1 part brown material. 2 parts of nitrogen source to 1 part carbon source. The nitrogen sources would be kitchen wastes, yard wastes that are green. The carbon sources would be wood wastes and leaves, and maybe a little bit of paper.
I'd like to say something.
Yes.
I try and use a similar formula, except on top of, I'll do a layer of green and a layer of brown, and then I'll also throw some soil on top of that.
Exactly.
And I think it's real important for introducing organisms into the soil, into the compost.
Good comment made on mixing material. Add a little soil to provide the organisms. Exactly. Yes.
What if you're using animal products like chicken manure and hay or something like that?
If you're using manures are primarily the nitrogen source. If you're using something like chicken manures, you'd have to back off from that ratio, not add, that volume of that material. It would probably be about 1/5 of that manure, or even 1/8 or 1/10 of the manure, depending on how hot it is, to the other proportion being your brown materials. The chicken poultry manure is very, very high in nitrogen. So that one you've got to be careful with. Other manures, again, it depends on the type of manure that you've got. Okay, next slide, please. Shredding of materials is important if you're using coarser materials. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, aeration. Questions were asked about aeration, and human power is used to aerate these. This is a 3-bin system that's being turned, and it's to provide the heat release and oxygen. Next slide, please. And you can monitor temperature. I don't do that. I use my own intuition to determine when to turn the pile. Next slide, please. Common, again, you don't want to sterilize the mass. You don't want to kill the organisms. Next slide, please.
If you put those layers of nitrogen and carbon and earth, would it heat up and kill the organisms in the earth?
No, not if you mix at a proper timing. In other words, for a pile like that, a regular 3-bin system, if you put all your material down, within a week you should turn that to prevent that. Now, I don't aspire as much to the layering technique. In other words, although I do it, you don't have to necessarily layer. You could just mix it all together, because then you're going to mix it again anyway within a short period of time. But it should not kill off those organisms. Again, a lot of them are very tolerant of high temperatures, particularly the bacteria. Next slide, please. Did I make any comments about that one? Back up, please. Lost track there. Okay, the odor problems. This is the one thing that you run into problems with primarily in a very suburbanized environments and apartment complexes. The big question always comes up is, am I going to have smells? Am I going to have odor problems? You can minimize odor problems by having the right mix of material and just keeping an eye on it. Get really close up to that compost operation, compost pile, and observe what's going on. Now, there are several reasons why you could have an odor problem. One is if you create anaerobic conditions. If it's too wet, okay, you're going to have anaerobic problems because the oxygen's been eliminated because the pores have been occupied by water. Okay, and a way to alleviate that is turn it. Mix it more frequently and add some absorbent material, or just turn it more frequently to allow the moisture to evaporate off. That very often will happen in the spring after this mass is frozen and then thawed out again, especially the kind of winter we had. Some compounds are smelly to begin with, particularly in garbage. And those compounds do break down with time. So mixing them within the pile helps alleviate that problem. Excessive nitrogen, I think, is one that's ignored by a lot of people. And that's a problem if you use a lot of grass clippings. If you put too many grass clippings, or if you leave them on a pile for a while, they will begin to smell. It's the ammonia that's causing the odor, and the anaerobic conditions that eventually occur, because those organisms have been stimulated and are using up the oxygen. Avoid that by adding your carbon source. Don't ignore the carbon source. Next slide, please. Toxic compounds. I think we've addressed that already with some of the questions you folks have had. It's a concern, something we should be aware of. Next slide, please. Okay, there are a number of systems. I'm going to go through these. I've got a little bit of time left. Anybody have the correct time again? It's about 9 o'clock?
Yeah, 8:59.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Pretty
About.
Okay. Now this is a compost. I took some of these slides at a workshop I went to out at it's Ithaca Community Gardens, and they had a nice community garden where they had some different compost systems working. And this is a compost pile built out of cinder blocks. Okay, they built the bin and then just threw all their wastes in there, and that's the kind of system that you can turn it as frequently as you want. It's a little cumbersome because you've only got the one bin in there. I like the series of bins so you can turn the material from one into another. Next slide, please. And this is a multiple bin system. This is from the Rodale Research Farm. And they had a series of bins here, and you can have compost at different stages of decomposition. And you leave a couple of bins empty that you can turn this stuff into. In other words, at some point, maybe after a week, they'll take this stuff and throw it in that bin. Okay, then they'll throw it into the next bin, or they'll rotate back and forth. And you leave one bin open for that turning process. Okay, and then with time, you've got some stuff that'll be well decomposed, ready to use. Okay, the problem is we generate some waste year-round, and if you keep adding to it, the stuff's going to keep breaking down, but you're not going to have that end product throughout the summer. Okay, but that may not be a concern. Yes?
So you basically, I wanted to ask, do you keep the batches separate then? You don't
Yes.
keep adding fresh to each batch?
Right, you can keep the batches separate if you want to have compost on a long-term basis. Yeah. If you're not concerned about that, you can mix the stuff together. Next slide, please. This is a fancier 3-bin system made out of wood. And again, but the same concept here. These slats could be taken off, and you could shovel the stuff out. It's pretty fancy. It's more of the Cadillac of composters. Or maybe the Volvo or the Honda. I don't know which one would be more appropriate. Next slide, please.
Do you recommend that the piles be in full sun to help with the heating process?
Question about piles being in a full sun. I put most of my piles out in the open, not in the shade.
Okay.
I think that's fine.
Does it, I mean, I'm in a shady area. Does it,
It's in the shade, it's okay too.
Okay.
I don't think sunlight really has that much of an effect. What it may do is if it's in very heavy shade, you may not be getting the rainfall on it, and that little bit of moisture may help out.
okay,
Also
thank you.
inversely, if it's in the sun, it might dry it out a bit too much.
Could dry it, yeah, you could, what I do is I put that piece of wood over it just to keep it from drying out excessively. Now, this is the, I don't know, maybe the Chevette of composters. This is my approach. Like I said, as I've gone along with this, I've become less technical. I've become probably cheaper and wanting to expend money on this, but it works fine. And these are 2 bins that I built last year in the fall. It's in an altitude of about 1,800 to 2,000 feet, top of a hill. Very cold, frosts in September, mid-September, frost through late May. It's in New York State. So it's pretty harsh conditions. And what I did was I built these 2 composters. I built the one on the left first out of 1/2 inch hardware cloth. And I just got several sections of it, knocked the stakes in the ground, wired right to it. And I had a bin about 3 feet high, 3 feet across, 4 feet across, about that wide. I threw all my yard wastes in there from at the fall when all the plants were killed off. Threw them in there, put in a bunch of leaves, a couple of bags of leaves, threw some kitchen wastes in there, and in November put in my red wigglers, which is totally against what they recommend. So I'm going to try it anyway. I threw the wigglers in there, and we had snow the next day, a small snowstorm. We were buried with snow. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero frequently. And the mass was freezing. I was getting in there trying to get what I would do is dig a hole, put my kitchen waste in there, and cover it up. I had some leaves on the side that I would put on top. And most of it froze during the winter. I went out there in the spring, dug in there, and there were some worms in there that survived. They actually survived those conditions. And what I did was I built the second one with 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and I'll make a comment why I did that. And I took the stuff out of there and threw in there, and it was anaerobic. It smelled. It smelled pretty bad. But I threw it in the second bin, put more leaves in there, about 50-50 mix, and then some worms were transferred in the process. Now in that first bin, I threw some more yard waste that I had, done some trimming, etc. But what happened was some snakes got in there. So I call that my snake bin on the left. And I think they took care of any worms that were left over in there. Now this bin, the 1/4 inch, they can't get in, the snake can't fit through those openings. So that doesn't have any snakes. It's still got a lot of worms. And I inoculated some more this summer. I purchased some through the mail and I put them in there. I had a mouse in there under the wood. And I was hoping that the mouse would go from there into the other bin to feed the snake. But it got out. I chased it out, and I think the snakes did take care of it. Now, the rock pile has nothing to do with the compost. That's what I took out of my garden. On the right is my bag of leaves, and on the left is my sawdust that I use for my carbon sources. And the nitrogen sources is my kitchen waste that I put in there. Okay, next slide, please. Now, that's a close-up of the snake bin, and I can't see the snake in there. It was moving around pretty quickly, so I was unsuccessful getting it in a picture. Next slide, please. But they are very important. They have kept they work through the garden periodically, and they've really kept it pest-free. Now here's how I approach it. I've got that old compost from the prior year on the bottom, and I've scattered some pea shells and some garbage. Next slide, please. And I've thrown a few paper towels, maybe quite a few this time. Some orange peels, corn husks, leaves, lettuce leaves, etc. Maybe about an inch thick, over 3 feet across. So it's not much. It's primarily myself and my brother, and then once in a while he gets his 2 kids to visit, so they produce a little more. And so it's variable throughout the year. Okay, next slide, please. Then I throw on my carbon sources. In this case, a handful of sawdust. Next slide, please. And some leaves. and it's about a 2-to-1 mix, and I leave it like that. And that's how I've done it for most of the summer. And I've dug in there periodically with a stick to loosen it up. And it is decomposing really nice. And I really think that sawdust, the carbon source, has done the trick.
2-to-1 carbon to nitrogen?
2-to-1 nitrogen to carbon. In other words, 2-to-1 of my garbage, 2 parts of my garbage to 1 part of the leaves and sawdust. If you use all leaves, you could almost go 1-to-1. If you use more sawdust, you got to decrease that, because the sawdust has a much higher...
You're not using any manure?
No manure. No.
Why don't you use any manure?
I just don't have any access to any. I don't want to take the effort to do it. I feel I've got enough raw materials that I need on
But if you had, you would.
If I had, I would, definitely.
Right.
Yep. Next slide, please. And now this is a modification. This is a bin I built at another site, and this was a vermicomposting bin that I built because I was concerned about winter kill. And what I did was I built a 2-core system. The inner core is only about 2 feet across. The outer core is about 3 to 4 feet across, and they're all 3 feet high. And what I did was I packed the outer core with leaves, and the inner core was getting my fresh organic materials. And that's where I put the worms on the inside. And this was done 2 years ago in the fall. I tend to do things really out of sequence. I added the worms in the fall, figuring, let's see if they'll survive. And these survived very well with that insulating core on the outside of leaves. Now this bin has been, I've left the stuff to break down. I've got this nice black material in there. It's finished compost, primarily earthworm wastes, and it shrunk down to half. And I put in leaves from 2 large trees from 2 falls in there on that outer core. I packed them in, and it's been decomposed. The worms, what happens is they migrate back and forth in that mass. Yes?
Yeah, I think you already said this, but I'm not sure, about 2 kinds of compost bin styles. One of the problems with a style like that with a wire is that you don't, unless you turn it often, you don't get composting right out to the edges.
Right.
If you use bales of hay, make the actual compost bin width, get composting right out to the ends and into the hay.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're lazy like me, you don't really turn your pile.
Right. What I way around my problem here is sometimes I would take this stuff and throw it in the middle, during the summertime. But you're right. That outer part doesn't really decompose much. The way that is alleviated a bit is the worms sometimes get close to the outside to help decompose it. But you're right. The hay bales works that would be real nice.
This guy was saying about you got to shade a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I have the same thing.
Okay.
It's less of a problem if you use the hay because you're conserving moisture and you're also conserving the heat. I think with cover of leaves and some shade, you're not getting, if it pours out, you're not getting saturated.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that a 1/4 or 1/2 inch that are down?
This one here is 1/4 inch on the inside, 1/2 inch on the outside. The only reason I did that is I don't know why I did it that way.
That's what you had.
That's what I had available. That's right.
Did you cover that?
Did I cover it? Yes, the inner one is covered with wood, and I think the next slide please, I think shows it. Yeah, I have a little piece of wood to cover it. It was primarily for the winter time. We had so much snow this past winter. Now this was in a good location. It was on the east side of a garage, so all the northwesterly winds were cut down significantly in the winter time. The worms survived and has been through 2 winters, one very mild winter and one very more seasonal like we had this past year. Next slide, please. And there are others. You can even compost in one of these little plastic, I guess these weren't manufactured for that reason, but or distributed for that reason, but I find that real interesting the way to set that up. And that could be used for worm composting for a very small operation. Next slide, please. These are some other systems. I'm just going to go through these to show you what there is. And I have some reservations about some of these because they're primarily done for aesthetics and to try to control odors. And I think if you do it right, you don't really have to worry about it. And they're also done to keep unwanted guests out of there. Now this is a kind of a fancier version of what I have. But it operates the same way. And I'll make comments about the other ones. I've got some individual slides. Next slide, please. You can compost in a trash can. The problem there is creating anaerobic conditions. You notice some holes are poked in there to provide some aeration, but that does not work all that well. But it's, again, to isolate the environment. Isolate that environment from the surrounding area. Next slide, please. We have this fancy one here, which is really no different than a bin system. And there's the tumbler composter. Next slide, please. And I've used the tumbler composter. I use that one as well for some wastes. Convinced my parents to get one too, and they have one in their backyard. And they live in a real suburbanized environment. And they constantly throw in their waste and turn it very frequently. What you have to do though is you add your waste, you want to let it build up some heat in there. So you wait maybe about a week, depending on how much material you're adding. And then you'll feel the heat in there, and that's when it's time to turn it. You can turn that on every day if you want to speed it up. Now I have some concern about the marketing that is done for some of these products. They say you can get compost in a week, you can compost in 14 days. You really don't get totally decomposed material. You get close to compost. It needs to stabilize over a longer period of time to really be true humus. Okay, next slide, please. Problem with these two is they do freeze up in the wintertime. That whole thing will freeze right up. And there's no way around it. And here's my carbon source again, to emphasize the need for that. Next slide, please. Yes, question down here.
Can you give us the critical mass that you're talking about of 3 feet minimum, 5 feet in a barrel out there? Does it matter?
You're approaching somewhat of a 3 feet. It's less of a volume, though. And with that system, you know, if you don't want to pack it full, because then it's almost impossible to turn. So you're not really reaching your maximum. You probably have a minimum volume in there, though, to suffice composting. Yes?
The fellow who gave the talk on using earthworms.
Okay.
He was using red wigglers. He was in Rhode Island, and he found that his bed, he had to go out to get some for show and tell day, was frozen down about 4 inches. Mm-hmm. But they were working right below where the ice stopped.
Okay, yep.
Which surprised me.
Sure. That minimum temperature, yeah, that is surprising. But I guess they will survive.
He offered a box that he put his stuff in. And I would think that it was a smaller volume.
Okay.
And he could choose to use vermiculture instead of the traditional heat biological.
Okay.
You could handle a smaller volume of waste.
Right. That's a very important point. For vermiculture, vermicomposting, you can use much smaller volumes. And you want smaller volumes because you don't want that heat buildup. You want to operate at lower temperatures. What's the trade-off? Well, don't throw anything that has plant diseases on it, weed seeds, etc., because vermicomposting won't alleviate that. The high temperature of thermophilic composting takes care of plant diseases, takes care of possibly weed seeds, most of them. But if you're doing vermicomposting, just don't add those raw materials to the product. The vermicomposting, the advantage is you can do it on a much smaller volume. Yes, next slide. Oh, this one, okay. This is also a kind of a fancy type of composter, and it's the kind that you add to the top, and you take this slat out and remove it from the bottom. And aeration is provided by the openings. Next slide, please. These are all fairly expensive. We're talking, some of them range of $80 to $100 for some of these. And this is just a plastic bin supported with the wire. No different than a bin system. Next slide, please. This one here is a German manufactured model. And this one here has so many holes in it that it dries out excessively. And that can be a real problem. It dries out and it doesn't operate as well as the other types of tumblers. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's just to show you another version of it. This one here is kind of an interesting one. It's really just a modified sheet composting. Basically, you dig a hole and you're putting your compostable materials in the ground, they recommend adding the activator. You don't need to, you can just add some soil, and then capping it with this, or, I'm sorry, actually you open the top and dump it down in there. I don't really see, has anybody ever used one of these? I don't really see any kind of advantages to going this way other than making it look nice and isolating the odors and keeping ornamental animals.
Composting, and it was a real mess. It was just turned to slime. You know, a hole was dug and everything was thrown in there.
Okay.
And I had to go back and dig it out and mix it, and it was just gross.
Yeah, probably too many anaerobic conditions took right over.
Yeah, it was totally anaerobic.
Yeah. I think the next process is better. Next slide, please. Simply bury the stuff in the ground, sheet composting. And I've done that too. I've had a lot of garden waste that I want to overload my compost. I'll just dig out a trench and bury it in place. You can do that with garbage as long as you go down at least about 6-10 inches. Keep the animals from digging it back up.
And that's just nitrogen stuff?
This is probably, I wasn't too worried about that because my soil's pretty low in nitrogen. So I wasn't too concerned about that. It would decompose slower though because of the more anaerobic conditions that would be at that spot, or anaerobic pockets. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, then when we have our compost, the question is, what can we use it for? And again, I haven't mentioned too many specifics here. I've done that purposely because I'm not going to tell you within 3 weeks you'll get compost if you turn it this frequently. It depends on what you're adding. And again, I suggest that you try doing it and use a simple system and really watch what you're doing and watch the process. I dig around and I see what's going on. I watch the earthworms, the ants, etc. I see what's going on, smell the material, whether it's good or bad. Your nose and your eyes are going to tell you more than any book. And to me, I think that's worked very well for me. So, again, I'm not going to give you any kind of real specifics here. Any formulas, I've given you a couple, but they're very general. Once the compost is done, true compost is really humus. It's a humus material. It's stabilized, decomposed material that then will decompose very slowly. Some components of this compost may take hundreds of years to break down. The real resistant fraction of humus takes that long. Okay, so it's stable enough to add to your garden. Okay, next slide, please. We can use it in potting mixes. And again, don't defeat the purpose. Don't go, some people recommend sterilizing compost. Shouldn't have to, because the beneficial organisms have done the job. Okay, they've, by competition, killed off your pathogens. Yes?
What about damping off, what you're doing there?
Damping off. Good question. Ideally, you should have killed off the organisms that cause damping off. On a precautionary measure, you can use the milled sphagnum, to prevent damping off from occurring. There's some concern though about sphagnum mosses as far as mining this material and creating an environmental problem.
Also, water from the bottom up, like if you had a plastic
Okay,
right there.
bottom watering should prevent damping. You can use cultural practices like proper seeding density, not overseeding and not overwatering to prevent the damping off problem. I haven't really used compost for my seed material yet. I've used it primarily for my garden. Next slide, please. Can be used in a garden. This is my garden, and I use compost primarily in the spring. I add the compost in the spring. I've used leaf compost, my own compost. I spread it and turn it in, primarily to supply some amount of humus to that soil. I have a very stony clay soil that needs it. Yes?
What size is your garden?
Garden is about 30 feet by 40 feet.
And it's about the size of my garden. How much compost, how much does it satisfy your needs? I'll tell you what my problem is. I'm not going to go into the long thing.
Okay.
I'm doing small scale composting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm getting small amounts of compost.
Sure.
And I have about 1,000 square foot garden, and it seems where do you draw the line? It seems to me that I have to be larger scale at this point, because I don't have enough.
That's I don't produce enough compost for myself to supply to that garden. So I get leaf compost from a community compost operation, locally, where they compost leaves, and then you can get bags. And I got 5 big bags of leaf compost that I added to this, plus the stuff I had. So it's not enough for my size garden.
Right.
The only way you can do it is import some, or bring in some more raw materials. And my feeling is you can bring something in, bring in some finished compost if you have access.
I'm getting more and more composting bins.
Okay.
I just don't have enough.
Yeah, and that would be the approach to use, sure. Yes?
I just want to say that when you build your compost pile, and when you look at it and you see the big old mound, it's not going to be that way after it's done. It's going to probably about a third of that.
Yep.
I mean, it's great stuff.
Yeah.
It's like magic. But
Sure.
It's not enough.
Yeah. Now, one way around it is rather than spreading it over the whole garden, put it, if you're planting tomatoes, peppers, etc., put it in the planting hole. And I have done that too.
Yeah, and also just the first couple of inches.
So,
What I done.
If
Yes.
you have a great deal of, say if you have a lot of compost, our problem is we get a lot of weed growth on and we talk mostly manure
Okay.
on the top of the pile. And I just wonder if you could cover, if it would be wise to cover a whole pile to prevent weed growth, would that limit the moisture to such an extent that you wouldn't get good composting?
It depends on the size of the pile. If you cover a very big pile, you might be trapping some heat and air. It's debatable. Again, I've seen people who suggested actually covering piles to allow for heat buildup, speed up the process, and to prevent what you're talking about.
Would it be better to cover it with a reflective light material?
You could, something that won't absorb as much heat.
You could
That would-
also cover 2 inches of sawdust or 3 inches of sawdust, and that'll stop a lot of weed seeds from germinating. You know, if you just look in the yellow pages, you can find a sawmill, and then you just, they'll load your truck, big huge pickup, for $5, $10, and be all the sawdust that you need. And easily recovered.
Sure. Yes, question here.
I just wonder, it seems that with my yard that I don't have enough say carbon type stuff.
Okay.
Now, say you cut down your flower plants and they're green, you just set them aside and they turn brown. Does that turn into carbon material?
Yep. What's happened is the nitrogen compounds have dissipated, volatilized off, been utilized, broken down. Yeah, that becomes carbon material.
And with those thin sort of plant stalks, can you put those in the compost?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. That'd be fine. I've done that. I've done tomato plants, peppers, dead, dried up. Sure. Yes.
Could we finish the election and save the questions?
Sure. The last slide. We can also use it, as this young gardener is, for container gardening. And that is the end of my slides.
All right.
Okay.
If you could slide on that bin you had with the worms and then the surrounding leaves, how did you, if you used the ratio, if you used carbon nitrogen, how did you prevent heat burn up, heat accumulation that would kill off the worm?
Okay, in my worm bin, what I've done is I've added in thin layers. My bin is less than the minimum size. In other words, it's not the 3 by 3 by 3. It's less than that, so I'm allowing for dissipation of the heat. And that's preventing kill of those worms. Yeah. We use size volume to prevent that. Yes, any others? Starting up here.
A couple of years ago, I didn't have enough garden space for my butternut squash, so as an act of desperation, I took some soil and put it on top of my compost bins and put my butternut squash in there, and it, first of all, was warm, which they liked. It had plenty of food for them. It's gotten rid of all my weeds because there's no competition, we just can't live there. And it seems to break down the compost without me ever turning it. And my compost bins look excellent because they're just covered with vines and tremendous bumper crops each year of butternut squash that I could have never gotten out of my garden beds. And it's just synergetic almost.
That's right. Yep. That's a way, again, of getting around that problem of perhaps some weed growth in there. But I've got the same thing. I've got a bunch of, primarily the squashes, cucumbers, germinating right out of it. Yep. Yes.
I was intrigued by, I know you said with the hemlock trimmings you wouldn't use them, but say if you trimmed a privet hedge or something like that, could you shred that stuff up?
That would be fine. Yeah. Any kind of deciduous prunings or anything that's non-conifer, definitely I throw on there. If it's green, count it as green material. If it's dried up, count it as brown material.
And what kind of shredder would be good, or how small does it need to be?
Lawnmower.
That's a good question. Maybe an inch, particles an inch, 2 inches. You want them broken down so at least you provide that surface for the organisms to break it down and chop up the bigger material. And these standard small shredders should do the work. Stuff that's an inch in diameter or half-inch in diameter, you need to really shred that up. And it should do the job.
Do you shred your leaves?
I don't shred my leaves, but you could. That could speed it up. But I don't shred my leaves up. Yes.
As far as taking compost from a community compost pile, I'm afraid of the pesticides and herbicides that are in the clippings. I think I should not do that.
If grass clippings have been used, I'd be a little hesitant. If it's strictly leaves, I would not worry. I think there's a real distinction there. I think because of the doses used on both of those, I mean, they don't spray continually on trees in communities like people do their lawns. I mean, if you get a community compost operation that's got clippings collected from people's lawns, you don't know what they put on their lawn. And some of those herbicides, they are not certain whether they break down or not. There's just not enough data out there to prove it one way or another. So I would, be on the side of caution and not use that on any kind of edible crop. I've seen people take lawn clippings, use them as a mulch, and kill their tomatoes because of the weed killer that's remained within that plant. Because that's the way weed killers work. They get into the plant and kill it, and the residue's right within the plant. So I'd be real hesitant. Yeah. Yes?
Did you mention anything about pine needles? They are deterrent to good decomposition.
Right.
How much, let's say if it's needles mixed with deciduous leaves,
Yeah, it's...
50/50, is that a problem as much as?
I would say if you mix it, if you have some pine needles in there, I'd say a guess on my part, if it's no more than 1/10 of your pile with pine needles, I don't think it'll be a real big problem. What'll happen is they'll just break down a lot slower. If you're not concerned about creating compost within a couple of months, put them in there and don't worry about it. Next year, they'll probably be broken down because of the action of the fungi that are in there. But if you have a lot of pine needles in there is your only carbon source, that would be a problem because the organisms wouldn't be able to get at the carbon, for their energy source. And you'd have a real problem with that. But if you provide some other more readily available carbon source, you'd be okay. Anything else? Yes?
Apologies for a simplistic question. Can you give the scientific name for the red wigglers? So
Eisenia, it's E-I-S, I don't know about my spelling, E-I-S-E-N-I-A. In fact, I have a catalog, I think shows the name. Eisenia foetida.
Gesundheit. F-O-E?
Or F-O-E-T-D-I-A, I think.
Thank you.
It's something to that effect. Again, I apologize for I thought they had them in, here we go, worms. Okay, they don't give the name. They just call them red wigglers, but it's E-I-S-E-N-I-A.
Otherwise known as red worms?
Red worms, manure worms, red wigglers.
Okay.
Most garden catalogs have them. They sell them as composting worms.
Right.
So those would definitely be the ones
And
you
you do want to segregate those from the common garden earthworm variety?
Yes, and also if you took those red wigglers and spread them on your garden, they'd die off pretty rapidly because they don't compete well with the earthworms. So you want to segregate them. You want to feed them, provide them an environment that's isolated from every other earthworm, and you're providing them with the food, and they will stay there.
So in that case, you'd also want some kind of impermeable phase sides to your...
I don't know. I put cardboard down when I set my bin up to prevent the worms from migrating out. But when I built my second set of composters, I didn't even bother doing that, and they didn't migrate out because the food was there. They stayed where
And other
the food
earthworms
was.
didn't migrate in?
No, I didn't get any. I think probably because I have a very low population of earthworms in that site. Yeah.
Just a suggestion for people like you that are looking for more raw material. If you have friends that work in restaurants that are more or less organic or vegetarian, this may contravene health codes in wherever you are from, but it's a good source if you can.
Yeah, I don't have a raw material for it, I'm just not composting enough.
Generating enough.
Okay.
Well,
increase
increase
your raw materials and you'll get more.
But over a year's time, the oak leaves, without shredding them or anything, if they mix with manure and other things, they break down.
They'll break down. Okay. Yes.
I just want to say, adding amendments like the rock phosphate. If you add that to your compost, if the garden's low in phosphate, you can add it to the rock phosphate, and that'll break down quicker and make it more able for the plant to absorb it when it's in the compost to do decomposition.
That's an excellent point. If you got a soil low in a particular nutrient, particularly phosphorus, which is a problem, adding those mineral forms of phosphorus, rock phosphate, to a compost pile speeds up that release, definitely. Very good point. Which kind of brings me to another point is, should you add lime to a compost pile? I don't. The pH doesn't really drift much within a compost pile. Within a compost pile, what happens is the pH tends to stabilize and the carbon-nitrogen ratio tends to get narrower. So your end product has close to neutral pH, C to N ratio that's close to what you have in soil. So I never add lime to my compost pile. I really don't think you need to. Even if you're adding a little bit of acidic material, I really don't feel that that's necessary.
I really think that you shouldn't, that it slows down decomposition.
It may also cause loss of nitrogen too. You raise your pH too high, so.
That's right. One
Yes.
question. You know, everything I've read about composting and everything, you go through this meticulous layering of it, and then a week later you turn it. So what, I mean, what?
There's no, I don't think there's a need to the nice layering approach. It's mostly to make you aware of what you're adding. And proportions. It's a way to ensure you're adding the right proportions,
But that's how everyone does it, right? I mean, there's
people just say, well, layer it this.
Putting it back, right?
There's no magic to it other than ensuring you get the right amount. Yeah, you're right, because you're going to mix the whole mass up.
Every time I do that, it occurs to me.
But for the starting up, if you layer it, the initial composting effect is going to be, much quicker. If it's in the layers, you'll have a better mix.
You'll have the proportions, the right proportions.
So I mean, eventually you'll turn it, but I mean, to get it started, it's a pretty good idea to mix it.
Sure. Gives you the right ratio.
Actually, you take each layer off and turn it individually and then. That's right.
We had a question here.
Someone asked this before, and I just wanted to kind of clarify, just because I had always heard that you got to have some animal manure in there to really get it going. I mean, is it dehydrated cow manure? Should I throw a little of that?
Don't need it. The reason they say add manure is two reasons. There are two reasons. One is add nitrogen. The other is add the organisms, serve as the inoculum of organisms. You can do that with soil. You can get your nitrogen from kitchen waste, from your yard waste, etc. You do not need the manures in
But
there.
do you need soil or manure? I mean, do you need something to have some of those?
To be honest with you, I didn't even add soil to that worm bin that I've got. Of course, you can add some finished compost, throw it in there to serve as an inoculum. But if you've got garbage, kitchen waste, you've got yard waste that have been hanging around, there's bacteria on them, and they will get the process going. It'll just start slower.
I see.
Yep. It's a matter of how quickly you want it. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, all my kitchen waste comes right from the kitchen in a small thing and then goes out on the deck in this big thing. And by the time that's full and been sitting in the sun for about 2 weeks, it's got plenty of bacterial action going on in it.
Sure.
It's offensive,
Tell you when it's time to move it?
Well, I always make sure I have plenty of leaves and stuff to put over it tonight.
What's your opinion on the human composting toilets? You're used to that after a period of time.
I don't know. I don't know enough about it to make a comment on it. I think if properly designed, all the pathogens should be killed. I mean, there are facilities that use composting toilets, but what they do is they suggest not using the end product on food crops. And because it's a concern maybe about metal contamination or about, more than that, about pathogen problems.
I don't really understand why we're so hesitant about the human pathogens and we don't give a hoot about the animal.
Exactly.
We're so eager, in fact. I don't understand that.
It's human nature. Anything that has to do with human waste, there tends to be a real resistance to.
Human urine is good, right?
Yeah.
Fine, yeah, source of nitrogen is free of the organisms. Yeah.
Nobody in your family has cholera, huh?
The virus. Yeah.
Nice one.
Yeah. I'd say they're definitely sure that all the bacteria die off, the fungi die, but it's the viruses that, if used raw, even raw sludge applied on land, most of the stuff dies off within a few days by competition. And they're just concerned about getting it right on the vegetation. So compost would be much safer to use than raw material. Yes?
Just about horse manure. You mentioned getting it from racetracks and stuff. I just heard the other day that at the racetracks, they have this bug spray, fly spray that they use to keep the flies off the horses. And that's just going indiscriminately right on the manure. So that's all. I don't think you probably want to use that.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. But I would definitely avoid using that.
There's a product that I've seen in my barn. I don't think they use it. My brother's horse that you actually feed the animal and it goes into the manure and kills flies.
Okay,
You
that's a
travel
systemic
through the
thing.
horse, and
Yeah.
it's actually insecticide. Something to
So,
be aware of.
Something you want to avoid, yeah,
Go to your local
definitely.
Certified.
One last
I
question,
read,
and
it's,
then
it's just a comment about human waste. I read about a year ago that the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority is marketing the end product of its sludge now that they finally don't send it into Boston.